Well, congratulations. We are now more than halfway through the book of Genesis, the book with the most chapters in the Torah, or the Pentateuch, or the Law, whichever you prefer to call the collection of those first 5 books. And if you've been keeping up with the messages, either in person or on YouTube, you've been doing the reading, I'm sure that now you have committed to memory the big picture of, we might say, the first half. And in a couple of more times, you're going to have the whole of Genesis, the big picture, committed to your memory. And of course, chapters 1 through 11 is sort of unique to itself, just like 12 to 50 is in a different style than chapters 1 to 11. In chapters 1 to 11, we talked about the creation, the fall of humankind, the flood, and then the division of the nations, and the story of the Tower of Babel. And then chapters 11, there's a transition, and we go to about a time period of about just roughly 4,000 years ago. We start at a place called Ur of the Chaldeans, which traditionally was understood to be near the Persian Gulf, though, as I mentioned, there are some modern scholars that suggest maybe the location was actually in northern Syria. Anyway, we were introduced to 4 people: Sarah, Abraham, Lot, and Terah. And if we were to do that in age, it would have been Terah, Abraham, Sarah, and Lot. And they're living there, and they decide they're going to go to Canaan. And so they start to travel in the direction around the desert, and that would have led them, at least traditionally, along the Tigris and Euphrates River. They get to Haran. That's where they end up settling, and they're there until Terah dies. And then we know that God comes and calls Abraham to go to a place that I will show you, right? So Abraham, he and Sarah and Lot, they pack up with all their stuff, and then they head down to Canaan, and then they enter Canaan, and then they continue to travel, as we've talked about. And we learned about some geography, right? The Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, or also known as the Salt Sea, and then to the west, the Mediterranean. And in an area that they travel through, and that has become known as Israel. Now, of course, through all of these travels, Abraham and family make numerous stops, and we talked all about that story. And of course, the big story was in terms of the promise, right? The promise was he'll make him a great nation. He'll make his name great, and all the world will be blessed through him and through his descendants, through one of his descendants specifically, that we'll be talking about throughout that big picture. But the whole thing is his name becomes great. He has great wealth, lots is happening, but he doesn't have any children. And of course, we talked about that and how they try to help God out, which leads to the birth of Ishmael. And then when God, in his own timing, when God has things as he wants them to be, Sarah has Isaac. And of course, then Isaac grows up, and then Abraham says, "Hey, you need a wife so we can continue this family thing, this descendant thing." And so he sends a servant who comes back with a beautiful young woman, Rebecca, who we're told Isaac loves. And again, the story is God reaffirms his promise and the blessings that he made to Abraham, to Isaac. And again, the same issue, though, no children are being born until it comes to this point where Isaac does pray, and Rebecca becomes pregnant with actually twins. And they weren't identical twins. In fact, the twins were in so many ways opposite, other than they shared the same gender. Esau and Jacob. Esau, more daddy's boy, like the outdoors. He was a hunter, and that's what Esau. And of course, Jacob stayed at home, more of a mummy's boy, and also a bit of a con man and a conniver and a con artist, you might say, who maneuvered in a couple of different ways. First, his brother out of his birthright, and then out of his blessing, which put him in the bad books with his brother. And so his brother wants to kill him when the time is after his dad has passed away. So his mother organizes to tell his dad, hey, we got to send him away to my people so that he can find a wife. And so that gets sent away. And of course, Jacob, on that first night on his trip, God meets him. And not because Jacob has done anything wonderful, but because of God's promise that he made to Abraham and Isaac and the plans that God had. He reaffirms his promise and the idea of blessings, of protection and so on, and provision to Jacob. And this is all in a dream, and Jacob wakes up and he says, yes, God, if you'll look after me and stuff, you will be my God. Anyway, he goes and he meets Rachel, who he'll later marry, who he wants immediately to meet her dad. And Jacob, he's also a good businessman. God's blessing him, and Laban, that's the father-in-law, does really well. And so he says, I want you to stay around. Let's strike up a business deal. What would you like? And, well, Jacob says, well, if I can have Rachel as my wife, I'll work 7 years for that. 7 years to have Rachel as my wife. Laban says, sure, we got that. And we can do that. And so he works for the 7 years, and this text says, and it was like days kind of thing. It seemed such a short period of time because he loved Rachel so much. Well, turns out the con man gets conned by his father-in-law, and he wakes up to find out that he's married Leah, the oldest sister. And he says, hey, what's going on? He says, well, the oldest sister always has to get married first. That's the culture. That's how it is. But if you work for me another 7 years, you can have Rachel. Wow. Anyway, so Jacob says, okay, but I'm not going to wait 7 years. So after an appropriate time, he marries Rachel. There's a competition between the two sisters, and they want to, provide children for Jacob. Leah, because she's not the favorite one, it says God looks he has his eye on her, he blesses her, and she has 4 children. And then we talked about how the culture was and the different things that went on, and back and forth with maidservants, and then Leah has some more, and then she actually has a daughter, and finally, Rachel has a son who is named Joseph. At that point, Jacob says, I've had enough. Things aren't going so well with everybody's getting jealous regarding my wealth and so on. Let's leave. Let's go back to the place that I came from. And I've been here close to 20 years. And so they leave. No word to the father-in-law. They just up and leave. And he's away shearing sheep. So 3 days later, he gets the news. And so he's off, and he catches up to him 7 days. God talks to him and says, hey, whoa, you be careful. And so they meet the next day. They sort of talk things out. And then Laban embraces, and he kisses his daughters and his grandchildren goodbye, knowing that probably this will be the last time they ever sees them. And so it's really a poignant and a sad moment for him. And he and his men leave. Now, of course, Jacob and his family and the people who look after the flocks and everything, they're traveling back to the place where he had fled. And so this is starting to weigh on Jacob as he gets closer, knowing that he is going to meet his brother who, when he left, had said, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill you, Jacob, right? That's what his heart was. He did. I'm not saying that he said that to him in person, but Jacob was quite aware of that. And so Jacob, always a man of plans and thinking things through and trying to come up with stuff, says, well, I'm going to send some messengers out first and let Esau know I'm coming. And I'm coming, you might say, in peace. I'm coming to restore relationship. I come in a good place and hope that things will be good. And so he sends the messengers out. They do find Esau. When they come back, they tell Jacob, yeah, we found Esau, and he's on his way to meet you with 400 men, with a small, I don't know, maybe that's not even a small army, depends on what scale of things, but when you're talking a single man, having 400 men with him compared to this herdsman, where we read that when Jacob hears this in Genesis 32:7, in great fear and distress, Jacob divides the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and the herds and camels as well. He thought if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that's left may escape. And so he's got this plan. Okay, we'll divide up, and he goes after one, right? The other will be able to get away. And then he does the smart thing, of course, and then he goes to prayer. And he acknowledges his fear before God. This is where I'm at, God. And then he also acknowledges and recites and says, God, these are the things you promised me. And he sort of works that through with God, right? These are the things you blessed me, and you've looked after me, and you promised me these things now, basically 20 years ago. And then after praying, Jacob then comes up with another plan the next day where he's going to try to pacify his brothers with gifts. And so he divides, so he has some animals that he sends out, and then he has a space of time. Then he sends some more out, and space of time, some more out. He had a number of herds or small groups of these animals going out as gifts to his brother. And then we read about, in chapter 32, in verses 22 to 31, we read a very different story. A story where Jacob, he stays behind, right? Others are going and he's staying behind. And we read about this wrestling match with this man who gives him a new name. This name goes from being Jacob, known as the deceiver, to Israel, because he has struggled with God and humans and has overcome, or have overcome. Verse 28. And in verse 30, we read, he called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. Well, it turns out that after that, Esau and Jacob do meet. And we find out that God had already went before, God had already prepared Esau's heart. Jacob approaches with humility, he shows honor, he shows deference. And in Genesis 33, verse 4, we read, but Esau ran to meet Jacob. Right? Listen to this, right? Esau ran to meet Jacob and he embraced him. God had already done a work in his heart. And he threw his arms around his brother and he kissed him, and it says, and they wept. Twin brothers, separated by all kinds of issues, time, space, 20 years, a reunion. And Esau, of course, goes on to meet Jacob's family, and he doesn't want any of the animals. He's like, what's with all those animals you were sending me? And Jacob, well, these are gifts to you. He said, I don't need them. Right? I've got lots. Things that went really well for me, right? Including these 400 guys that follow him. And he said, I don't need that, but Jacob insists. And Esau wants to travel with him, but he says, we don't travel nearly as fast with all the livestock. You just go on ahead. And so Jacob's still maybe a little cautious, as well as some practical things, but he's still sort of maybe not so sure. And he's got his own plans. And so we read that in chapter 33, 18 to 20, that after Jacob came from Padan Aram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. And then it says, for 100 pieces of silver, he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. And then he set up an altar and called it El Elohi Israel. That is God, the God of Israel. And this takes us back to that wrestling match, where he is given this new name. And making recognition that God has brought him through, this thing that had been probably in the back of his mind for 20 years, even as he was going through all his life and having children, getting married and having children and building this great wealth. In the back of his mind is, my brother wants to kill me. And God had brought him through all that. And he recognizes that. And I would guess even he could even look further back, because God has kept his promises. And so it's a very touching spiritual moment as he reflects on how God has been true to his word. That God was true to his character, true to his promise, true to his promise to bless, true to his ancestors. And so we have this touching spiritual moment, and so often, like life, we're doing great and it's all crash, and that's exactly what happened. He's got this land, he's sort of developing, and he's bought it, and he's settling in, and then a local son of the ruler sees his daughter and goes, I like her, I want her, and he didn't wait for marriage. He didn't do it the right way. In fact, Scripture uses the word he raped her, and the brothers are furious. Now, this young man, he wants her as his wife, and he's like, Dad, get her for me. But as was the custom, right? Get her for me. And his father, the ruler, says, hey, you can intermarry with us, you can be part of us, you can just settle in here, and we will welcome you with open arms. You'll be connected right through my son, who will one day probably be maybe the ruler. But the idea was that you will be able to intermarry and set up your culture here rather than sort of being this vagabond that keeps moving around. You'll have a home. You name the price, I'll pay it. Well, the idea was brothers come up with, well, we have to be circumcised. That's our requirement. And of course, in their recovery period, two of the brothers go rogue, you might say. And they go and they just slaughter these men. And it's like, wow. And then the rest of the brothers are coming home. And they see these men that are dead, and they're like, they take advantage of the situation. And they go and plunder the homes, the property of all these dead people. And they took their women and their children. Well, to say the least, Jacob is not impressed with Simeon and Levi, who started all of this, for putting them at the risk of destruction. Of course, now he has set up this home and he bought the land, and now they're going to be hated. And so they got to go again. But Simeon and Levi don't back down on this. They are not repentant. They defend their actions, right? Look what they did to our sister. And so they have to leave, and we read in chapter 5 that Jacob returns to Bethel, and he builds an altar to the Lord there, right? And he says, let's get things cleaned up, get rid of any foreign gods. We got to purify ourselves. We got to get back on track with God. And so they go through that process, and they bury the foreign gods and anything that had somehow come along with them. And we read in chapter 35 verse 5, they set out again. And so, of course, then they're out again and they're traveling again, homeless again. And the terror of God fell on all the towns all around them, so that no one pursued them. And so even there, God's protecting. And so then the story comes full circle. When in verse 35, Jacob comes, and all that are with him come to Luz or Bethel in the land of Canaan, this is, where he had built that altar, right? When God had appeared to him, revealed himself in that dream, that first night out. And so it comes full circle, and now he's back. And God has been faithful through all of it. And let's not say often at the front end of it, Jacob didn't see it. It's only looking back that he said, oh God was there. God looked after that. God looked after that. Just like sometimes in the front end, we don't see how things are going to work out. But on the retrospect, when we let God take care of it and don't mess it up as we are prone to do, like Jacob did a number of times. But we see how God, even in the midst of all of that, God is faithful. And in chapter 35, 9 through 13, we read, after Jacob returned from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him at that place where he had talked with him. And so God again affirms that promise and the blessing, and he says, it's still happening. And the story goes on to tell us that Rachel actually becomes pregnant one more time. But unfortunately, right, maybe I shouldn't use that word, but certainly sadly, at this point, she dies in childbirth. Sadly, she dies, but they say the little boy's name is Benjamin. And what we have, of course, there'll be some time of grief when we have the loss of loved ones. But then Jacob and Israel move on, heading back home, heading to his father's house, who is still alive. And so we get this story, we get this genealogy of his 12 sons, and then we get to find out that he gets to spend some time with his father. And chapter 35 ends with Isaac dying at 180 years. And his son Esau then and Jacob, they bury him. And so we see that restoration once again, that God has done a work in both of their lives. Right, and they've been through tough times and hard times. Jacob is, right, he's had all of the stuff that's gone on, and of course his dear wife Rachel has died. And now his father has died. But through all of that, God is still continuing his promise, right? That even in the hard times, God still does his work. And Esau and his brother are at peace. And then chapter 36 is a listing of Esau's descendants and a listing of rulers of Edom, right? These were Esau's descendants. And so there's this listing of his descendants in chapter 36, listing of the rulers before Israelite kings reign. And so we have that little history bit. And so we see that God is faithful to his promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he was going to make a great nation from his descendants. And one of the wonderful things I think that's always encouraging to me is that God is still able to work out his ways despite our imperfections, despite our flaws. And that he can even use adversity to further his process, his promises, and his will. Thanks for listening.